But this is what we did last time. The Habsburgs have been ruling Spain for a long time, but then this guy, Charles II, as historians like to say, his luck in the bedroom wore out. He died without an heir to the throne. And therefore, the Bourbons took over. Now, where were the Bourbons from? They're from France. And France and Spain oftentimes don't get along very well. I don't think they get along too well today. But they fought a war over this. This is one of Europe's major wars. This is the War of the Spanish Succession, in which Louis XIV of France, you've heard of him, okay, the Grand Monarch, Louis XIV, the Sun King, l'état c'est moi, as he liked to say it, decided his grandson would make a good king of Spain, and the rest of Europe basically went to war to stop that from happening. Why? Because if Louis XIV of France's grandson is the king of Spain, isn't he also in line to become king of France? Of course he is. And that would create a huge, powerful nation that the rest of Europe was not going to stand for. So that's why they went to war to stop it. They didn't stop it because Louis's grandson did become the king of Spain, and he founded the Spanish Bourbons. And see how the dates are kind of broken up here? I mean, they ruled from 1700 to 1808, and then 1813 to 1868, and then 1875 to 1931, and then 1975 to present. Why the chopped up? Well, you'll see. Things are really going to start to go wrong in Spanish history here before too long. And but they put a provision in the treaty that ended this war, the Peace of Utrecht, it was called. They put a provision that said, however, Louis's grandson can still become the king of Spain. However, the same person can never become the king of both. So that settled that problem. And there are a bunch of other things it said too, some of which we'll still be alluding to today, because some provisions of that treaty were somewhat detrimental to Spain, and therefore we're going to talk, those will come up again and again. We already have a couple of times. So that's what we did last time. So let's move on. We're now discussing the Bourbons, the Spanish Bourbons. And the next one we come across is Ferdinand VI. Now, you know when I say Ferdinand, in Espanol, it's Fernando. Okay? Ferdinand VI, I usually use the English names. I did for all the other nations, so why not continue that here? Ferdinand VI. This is what he looked like. He comes to the throne right in the middle of another huge war, although I don't think it was as huge as the War of the Spanish Succession, because it was the War of the Austrian Succession from 1740 to 1748, which ended really without any lasting benefit for Spain. And we'll discuss this war in more detail when we get to the German states, which of course includes Austria. Austria is a German state, right? Ferdinand, that you see up there, he was the second son of Philip V, the last one we talked about last time. He was the second son of Philip V and his first wife, Maria Luisa Cabrera of Savoy. So he was not first in line to succeed, but upon the untimely death of his older brother, he all of a sudden, his name was Luis, by the way, and he died in 1724, Ferdinand became the heir apparent, ahead of his two half-brothers, Carlos and Philip, we'll be getting to them later, whose mother was the bossy Elizabeth Farnese, Philip V's second wife. By now, everyone in Spain was eager for peace and to be rid of this overbearing foreign-born wife of Philip V, Elizabeth Farnese, that just mentioned, Farnese, if you want to use the Italian pronunciation. She was not only, she was the de facto ruler of Spain since 1714, because Ferdinand was just a baby So Ferdinand, once he starts his reign because he didn't like his stepmother, his father's second wife. So he started his reign by eliminating all the influence of the widow queen and her group of Italian courtiers. She brought a lot of people over from Italy to help run Spain. This was sweet revenge for the miserable childhood that he experienced after his father died, and she dominated the court and showered special favors on only her children and not Ferdinand's half-siblings. My dear sweet mother, may she rest in peace, her mother died when she was 2 years old, and her father put her in an orphanage until he found a second wife. And when he found a second wife, he came and got her, thank God. And but he owned a huge, he was rich. He owned a huge construction business in Nebraska. And of course, when he died, my mom's stepmother inherited the business, everything that he owned. And then when she died, she left everything to her 3 children. And not my mom and her younger sister, or actually it was her older sister. So see how sometimes things don't work out. As king, anyway, let's talk about him as king. He followed a steady policy of neutrality in the conflict between France and Britain, who were fast becoming the major enemies and starters of war in Europe at this time, and refused to be tempted by offers of either land or money if Spain would declare war on the other. In other words, if Spain would take sides. This is why many historians often refer to Ferdinand as the first of the Spanish Bourbons. Not only because he was born in Madrid, but also because he chose to steer clear of the French influence that characterized his father's reign. Fernando preferred to follow a policy of avoiding many of the European wars of the 18th century, of which there were many, and watch everyone else drain their treasuries while they fight these wars. This was not easy because in the back of everyone's mind is the simple fact, and the thing you have to remember about Spain during this time is that it was fast becoming a second-rate nation, losing power by the minute. But boy, did it have a great empire. It had a first-rate empire. The land that you and I are sitting on right now was once part of the great Spanish Empire. And of course, unfortunately, Spain lost it to Mexico when Mexico won its independence in 1821. And then actually, they didn't lose all of it because California still was part of Mexico. And then Mexico lost it in 1848. Well, what happened in June of 1848? They discovered gold here. And not just a little bit of gold. They discovered a lot of gold. And that gold today sits, supposedly, people say this is not true, but supposedly all that gold is stamped with the U.S. Treasury in Fort Knox, Kentucky right now. I mean, all that gold was sitting there all the time that Spain owned California, all the time that Mexico owned California, and Mexico loses it, bam. John Marshall was washing his dishes in a little stream up by Sutter's Mill, and he sees something glittering, and oh boy, all that gold, the famous gold rush of 1849. So all the luck was not with Spain. Let me put it that way. Yeah.
Where was that Spanish gold stored before the flags were gold?
Before we found it?
Before the United States beat Mexico.
It was in the ground. They didn't know it was there.
I thought you said there was some stored by the Spanish.
No, it was there all the time the Spanish owned California.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was all sitting there waiting for them, but they never found it. They just never found it. And then Mexico got it, and then we forgot it right after we got it because of the Mexican-American War. Okay? Everybody wanted to get a piece of the Spanish pie. So everyone was trying to draw Spain into these wars, and Ferdinand did a good job. We have to give him credit for keeping Spain out of that. But don't worry, it's not going to last. But like his father, he tended to be, his personality was kind of melancholy. He was shy. Shooting and music were his passions, and he kept far enough. Remember Farinelli? He was an Italian castrato. Ask somebody what a castrato is. I don't like explaining that. And he kept him because he had these beautiful notes that he could sing with his voice, and it soothed his psyche. So he kept him on from his father. His father hired him, and he kept him on. He was a member of the court, highly paid. Yeah, well, more ways than one. Ferdinand was married in 1729 to the Infanta Barbara of Portugal, the daughter of John V of Portugal. She shared his desire for peace and neutrality and reform. Uxorious. And I've been trying to convince my wife that this word also applies to me. Now, don't feel bad if you don't know what it means. I had to look it up too. We all have to look it up the first time, right? Uxorious is defined as one who is unusually submissive and devoted to one's wife. Okay?
Would it be uxorious?
Uxorious.
It's not uxorious?
Ux starts with a U.
All right.
Uxorious. Okay?
You're not signing the X. Uxorious. Uxorious.
X.
Yeah.
Uxorious. What can I say? That's the way the dictionary said to pronounce it, anyway. And he was very much devoted to his wife. Ferdinand and Barbara were very devoted to each other. And when it became clear that they would not have any children, unfortunately, they were deeply saddened. Many feel that the lavish spectacles and entertainments that they sponsored at court were kind of a substitute for their, well, their empty lives. Ferdinand, as I said a little while ago, he replaced the Italian and French ministers with Spanish ones. And under the competent leadership of his chief minister, whose name was Ensenada, finances were reformed, the navy was enlarged, and the Inquisition's gruesome autos de fe, as they were called in Spanish, where people were burned at the stake, were finally ended. These were years of tranquility and recuperation for all. Kind of a happy time, as just mentioned. The royal couple were devoted to each other and enjoyed sailing in that they built this toy fleet of barges that would sail up and down the Tagus River. Unfortunately, natural disaster struck in the form of major earthquakes that rocked the Iberian Peninsula in 1755 and 1756. Lisbon was almost completely, the capital of Portugal, was almost completely destroyed, as were many Spanish cities. This is the famous earthquake. You may recall it's mentioned in Voltaire's book, Candide. 2 years later, the queen consort died, and Ferdinand lapsed into the same mental illnesses typical of his family, especially his father. The death of his wife, Barbara, who had been devoted to him, and who carefully abstained from political intrigue, broke his heart. Between the date of her death, August of 1758, and his own just 1 year later, he fell into a state of bewildered melancholy in which he would not even dress. Wandered throughout the palace unshaven, unwashed in his nightgown. He died finally on August 10th, 1759, at the ripe old age of 45. Too bad, Ferdinand. He was succeeded by his half-brother, Charles III, who will become Charles III. Picture of Charles here. Charles, I think that would be fair to say, unlike most all monarchs in history, Charles came to the throne rather well prepared for his job. Since he had already been king of Naples and Sicily, now called the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, he had been king for 24 years. He was Charles VII in Naples and Charles V in Sicily. He had to be careful every time he signed a check where he was. Charles considered himself a product of the Enlightenment, which was raging, an intellectual movement that was raging through Europe at the time. We discussed the Enlightenment several times ago when we were in France. and therefore called himself, quote unquote, an enlightened despot. An enlightened despot. This is a title many monarchs of the age pretty much gave themselves, whether they deserved it or not. Charles I of England and Louis XIV of France, Catherine the Great of Russia come to mind. Charles III's attitude has been described as, and this is a quote, everything for the people, but nothing by the people. Although this statement has been ascribed to other monarchs as well at the time. Actually, Charles governed probably more despotically than Philip II. Philip II is one of the two great kings of Spain. Philip II, we talked about him a couple of times ago. Philip II and Charles I. They were the two greatest kings in Spanish history. If Isabella and Ferdinand were standing here, they'd argue with that too. They would probably want to be included. Another famous, somewhat famous statement attributed to Charles is, and I quote, my subjects are like children. They cry when they are washed. He, like most of his predecessors, ruled through astute ministers who tended to be either, once again, Italians or Spanish Francophiles, friendly toward France. But on the whole, Charles's ministers have been considered among Spain's best. He is remembered as the king who expelled the Jesuits from Spain, mainly because, as in several other European nations, their political meddling, the Jesuits, became so meddlesome in the political affairs of the nations in which they found themselves, they kind of wore out their welcome, as it were. Don't tell the current Pope that. He's a Jesuit too, remember? He also built some of the more memorable pieces of architecture that today adorn Madrid, the capital. The Royal Palace is the crowning example, and today serves as the Prado Museum, that if you've ever been to Madrid, that's on everybody's stop. Great art museum today where you can see the many works of Goya, Velázquez, El Greco, and others. Public works, really for the first time, took precedence over church building for the first time in Spanish history. Roads were improved and the Great Canal of Aragon was completed. Charles also called for Spain's first census in 1768. The British, for example, won't have their first census for another 33 years. And by the way, they counted 10.2 million people. 10.2 million people. To bolster the army, 1 man in 5 was drafted for an 8-year stint in the Spanish army. He entered the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War, we called it the French and Indian War over here, 1756 to 1763. But too late to do any good or influence the outcome. Britain really was the big winner in that one. But at least Spain came out unscathed. They didn't lose anything. Spain did become an ally of the Americans in the Revolutionary War, in our Revolutionary War, like France was, mostly out of hatred for the British than love of us. In fact, it was a combined Spanish-French fleet that blockaded the English Channel, freeing up the bulk of the French fleet to allow them to race across the Atlantic and up Chesapeake Bay, preventing the British from fortifying Lord Cornwallis at a little place called Yorktown, which, of course, his inability to reinforce himself at Yorktown is what led to his surrender, which is what led to us becoming an independent nation. Unfortunately, there was one place, Spain's big moment in this war, our American Revolution that is, was the 3-year-long Great Siege of Gibraltar. You see, in the War of the Spanish Succession, the British grabbed Gibraltar, which not only included the little peninsula with the great big rock that some insurance company used to use as their company logo, but if you control a strait, particularly a very strategic strait, that right there is going to make you a powerful, influential nation in the world. And the British had it since they've had it since 1701. And the Spanish won it back. And they didn't get it. Lord Eliot, the English defender of Gibraltar, Lord Eliot and his men successfully defended the rock, as they call it, to this day. You can see some of the gun emplacements cut into the rock to shore up Gibraltar's defenses against the Spanish trying to take them back. They did, however, they being the Spanish, did win back the Mediterranean island of Minorca, just offshore there, which, like Gibraltar, was also lost in the War of the Spanish Succession. But perhaps the greatest accomplishment in all of this is that Spain was able, once again, I bring it up, was still able to hang on to its great empire. And there's a map. Everything that's in the pink color is part of Spain's empire. And notice, as I said, it includes, here's California right here. All right? And we're talking almost all of Central and South America, as well as what is today Mexico, much larger back then than it is today. Florida, it included Florida at the time, and the vast Louisiana territory. However, this empire's days are numbered, as I said. Hang on, it's not going to last forever. And while all this was going on, there was that humble Franciscan priest named Junipero Serra, whose name you'll find all over Southern California real estate today, who built a string of 21 missions immortalized by millions of salt and flour maps of the state of California with toothpicks stuck in them where all the 21 missions are located. Every California grade school kid had to create. If you were lucky like me, you had an older sister who didn't throw hers away. I just used hers. When I got into the 4th grade, I just used hers and scratched out her name and put my name in there. But in spite of all this, Spain never could capitalize on its successes in the empire, mainly because of the aggressiveness of those who tried to steal whatever it was Spain found, which is a whole lot of gold and even more silver. We've got to remember, silver was really they found a lot more silver than they did gold, which is why silver isn't worth as much as gold is today. Mexico today is still the #1 world producer of silver in the world today, still. Interlopers, especially the British and the Dutch, would soon carve enough of a slice of America to present a serious challenge to the economic well-being of Spain. A popular saying at the time, another popular expression that historians like, is that Spain feeds the cow, but the rest of Europe drinks the milk. Okay? But during his reign, Spain for the first time was seen as a united nation rather than a collection of smaller kingdoms. Up till now, I've been reminding you every chance I get that there really was no Spain. It was a geographic designation of the Iberian Peninsula, of part of the Iberian Peninsula, because remember there's Portugal there too. All these little kingdoms, Asturias, Salamanca, all these different places. Finally, under Charles, you're going to be looked upon as one kingdom. And a national flag was adopted, looking pretty similar to Spain's national flag today, and a national anthem called the Royal March, which I believe is still their national anthem today, although I think the words have changed over time, kind of like Germany's had to change its words over time, Charles enjoys actually a pretty good reputation among historians, not only of Spain but of Europe. He may be the best of the rest of the Spanish kings, which is what I'm saying is it's all downhill from here on. They consider him to have been one of the most genuine and effective enlightened rulers of the 18th century. His rule exemplified the enlightened reform sponsored by a powerful monarchy so favored by many of the philosophers of the time that made up the Enlightenment. At the same time, his conservative habits and sincere piety deflected criticism from those many Spaniards who feared such reforms might be detrimental to their interests. Charles's death in 1788 meant he did not share, kind of a lucky time to die if there is such a thing, He died in 1788. Well, what's the next year after 1788? 1789. What happened in 1789? The French Revolution. And the French Revolution is not only, we studied the French Revolution when we were in France, didn't we? But I told you that the French Revolution just didn't affect France. It affected all of Europe. Some say all the world. And perhaps that wouldn't be true if it weren't for that little corporal by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. And he's going to extend the influence of the French Revolution tremendously. Okay? What happened to Charles? Apparently he caught a cold while out hunting, from which he never recovered. He was 72 years old. His second son inherited the throne, as the first son, Philip, was considered an imbecile and incapable of ruling. He was retarded. He was mentally retarded. Not supposed to use that word these days. It's very politically incorrect, but you get the idea. But as time went on, one wonders if maybe they shouldn't have taken the first son anyway. That second son will be known as Charles IV. And Charles IV. Charles IV, well, it sounds like an insult, but it's not meant to be, was a simple man of 40 with a taste for clocks. Clocks. Like Charles II was. Charles II, his hobby was clocks too. Remember he wanted to get them all to chime at exactly the same time? Can't do it. And he also liked fine embroidery. Don't ask. If Charles III was well prepared to be king, well, Charles IV was not. As much as Charles III was, Charles IV was not. He was indecisive, unintelligent, which is more than two strikes against him, considering the 2 decades of upheaval wrought by the French Revolution and Napoleon were about to come crashing down, not only on Spain, but all of Europe. He was dominated by his Italian wife, Maria Luisa of Parma. Parma was a small duchy in northern Italy at the time, owned by the Bourbons since 1731. Reports from members of the court portray Charles as well, they use the word dissolute. Dissolute. And the queen as downright abandoned to her sensuality. He had a one-track mind. Both of them did. Their advanced stage of physical and moral decay seems to have been admirably captured by Goya's masterpiece, The Family of Charles IV. I'm sorry I couldn't get I was going to enlarge it, but look at their faces. Blank stares. This is a good example of an artist intentionally rendering an unflattering portrait as possible without getting his head chopped off. Because this is not flat. You don't want to paint an unflattering portrait of the king. He'll chop your head off if he doesn't like it. I think this hangs in the Prado today. The family's blank stares are devoid of any emotion or intelligence. And this is the queen right here. Does that look anything like the previous picture you just saw of her? Doesn't, does it? No. Not very flattering. You got to be careful when you're doing this. Charles IV intended to maintain the policies of his father and kept on his same prime minister. His name was the Count of Floridablanca. In office, he stayed in office almost his entire reign, even though he had a profound belief in the sanctity of his office and kept up the appearance of an absolute powerful monarch. He never exercised more than a passive role in the direction of his own government. The affairs of government were left to his wife, Maria Luisa, and his prime minister, while he occupied himself with hunting
and his many mistresses. In 1792, political and personal enemies ousted Floridablanca from office and had him replaced with Pedro Pablo Abarca de Bolea, the Count of Aranda. I'll just call him Aranda from here on out. However, in the wake of the war against Republican France, because now Spain will go to war against Republican France, who has dislodged Louis XVI from the throne, a liberal-leaning Count of Aranda was replaced by Manuel de Godoy. Manuel de Godoy was a favorite of the Queen, and when I say favorite, I mean that in the biblical sense. Favorite of the Queen and widely believed to be her lover, but who also enjoyed the lasting favor of the king, who apparently was very understanding. Okay? Godoy continued Aranda's policy of neutrality toward France, but after Spain protested the execution of the deposed King Louis XVI that took place in 1793, France declared war on Spain anyway. After the declaration, Portugal and Spain signed a treaty of mutual protection against France. This led to the disastrous War of the Pyrenees, in which the French invaded and took territory in northern and eastern Spain. This forced Godoy to sign the Peace of Basel with France, by which Spain's frontier was restored, but its portion of the island of Hispaniola was ceded to the French. Although Godoy was widely criticized for this treaty, he received, after its conclusion, the title Prince of Peace. In August 1796, Godoy negotiated and signed the Second Treaty of San Ildefonso with France, which required that Spain declare war on Great Britain. This placed its ally Portugal in a difficult position because Portugal was allied with Great Britain. Spain remained an ally of France and supported Napoleon's continental blockade until the great British naval victory at Trafalgar. Remember the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Ended all hopes of ever, if there was any hope in the first place, of gaining back Gibraltar, which, as you know, they lost in the War of the Spanish Succession a century earlier. However, after Napoleon's victory over Prussia in 1807, Godoy again steered Spain back into the French side. This switching back and forth obviously devalued Charles's currency as a trustworthy ally. The return to the French alliance increased Godoy's unpopularity and strengthened his opposition, who called themselves the Ferdinandistas, friends of Ferdinand, the Ferdinandistas. The supporters of Crown Prince Ferdinand, who favored a close relationship with the United Kingdom, with Britain, against Napoleon and the French. Economic troubles caused by wars, the rumors, probably true, about the sexual relationship between the Queen, Maria Luisa, and the powerful Prime Minister Godoy, and the king's ineptitude caused the monarchy to decline in popular prestige. No kidding. Anxious to take over from his father as soon as possible and jealous of the Prime Minister, the Crown Prince Ferdinand attempted to overthrow the king. Yes, his own father, in an aborted coup. Coup is a French word we use for attempts to overthrow the government. It means to strike. Coup d'etat. In Spanish, in Spain, they're called pronunciamientos, pronouncements. Pronunciamientos, okay? Riots and a popular revolt at the Winter Palace at Aranjuez, about 30 miles south of Madrid, in 1808, forced Charles to abdicate, to give up the throne on March 19th in favor of his son, Ferdinand. Ferdinand took the throne as Ferdinand VII. Now you might be wondering, how come I'm not showing you a picture of Ferdinand VII tonight? Well, you'll see. But was not trusted by Napoleon, who by now While all this is going on, Napoleon had been sneaking French troops across the border into Spain. And by the time of this so-called abdication, 100,000 French troops were in Spain. Soon Charles began to have second thoughts about his abdication. So the ousted king appealed to Napoleon for help in regaining his throne from his son. So Napoleon, never one to miss a golden opportunity, especially one placed directly into his lap through no effort of his own, summoned both Charles IV and his son Ferdinand to Bayonne in France, along the French-Spanish border, in April of 1808. After listening to both appeal for their throne, Napoleon said, okay, both of you are hereby deposed. Okay? I'm not going to let any of you, either one of you, become king of Spain. And declared the Bourbon dynasty in Spain to be officially deposed and installed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as King Joseph I of Spain. What a guy. Napoleon's proclamation of this event began, and I quote, "Spaniards, after a long agony, your nation is perishing. I have seen your ills, and I shall remedy them." Charles, his wife, and Chief Minister Godoy, I guess we could call them the original menage a trois, were held, you know, Bob Hope used to always make a joke about menage a trois. He'd say, oh, I'd love to have a menage a trois, but I'm afraid I'd be the trois. I don't know what he meant by that, but anyway, they were held captive, all three of them were held captive in France for years. And after that, they wandered all over Europe, finally settling in Rome, where both he and his wife died in 1819, only 18 days apart. Godoy ended up in Belgium, I believe. I'll get back to his son, Ferdinand, later. But meanwhile, back in Spain, where Napoleon's brother Joseph is now ruling. So, Joseph I, sometimes called the intruder king, because he was put on the throne by Napoleon. There's Joseph. He'll rule from 1808 to 1813. Napoleon both overestimated his brother's abilities to rule this kingdom and underestimated the Spanish reaction to this seizure of their throne. Not that Joseph didn't have his supporters in Spain. Many young intellectuals flocked to the utopian-inspired New World Order. Remind me if you can, I'll stop if this reminds you of too much of current history. But the New World Order promised by the liberal ideas of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity for all, rallied many to support Joseph, many Spaniards to support Joseph. But by no means will this be enough to sustain him in power. The outburst of Spanish resistance was spontaneous and reckless at the same time, challenging Europe's finest army, the French army by this time, to combat without thought given to its own strengths or those of the enemy. Napoleon's fatal mistake was to underestimate these ill-trained, ill-equipped bands of Spanish patriots fighting for their homeland. And by summer, his army had suffered several serious setbacks. Although regular units fought in these battles, Spaniards soon became famous for their devastating hit-and-run tactics carried out by small groups in what they called their little war. Their little war. I've talked to you about this before. What's the Spanish word for war? Guerra. Guerrero. Ever meet a Hispanic person whose last name is Guerrero? Or we say Guerrero, but Guerrero means the warrior. The warrior. Okay? Well, in Spanish, well, actually in all languages have this ability to diminutize a noun, make it smaller, okay? And in Spanish, there's a variety of ways you can do it, but one of the ways you can do it is to add ia to the end of it. And so their war became a guerrilla. A guerrilla. A little war. But the rest of the world, either because they don't know this or because it's too difficult to pronounce, they change it to this word. I think there's only one L, guerrilla, in there. We call it guerrilla warfare. Okay? After the animal that lives in the central highlands of Africa. Okay? Has nothing to do with that. Nothing to do with it whatsoever. Okay? The little war. This often romanticized style of fighting was perfectly suited to the rough Spanish terrain and to the character of its residents. And ever since then, the hit and run tactics, you fight and retreat and hide from the enemy and wait until you find out where his next weak spot is and you attack only his weak spots. You never throw your entire army against their entire, because you know you'll lose. And the Spanish realize that, okay? But they're about to get some help. Napoleon was so upset by these small Spanish victories that in November of 1808, he arrived with 135,000 additional troops to take personal command of the Iberian Peninsula. Thus begins what history calls the Peninsular War, named after the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish, by the way, call it the War of Independence. That's their name for it. And it will drain Napoleon of so many resources that it is just as responsible for his ultimate collapse as the famous or infamous, depending on which side you're on, 1812 campaign against Russia. Just as responsible. But before that, in a month of brilliant generalship, he Napoleon completely reversed the tide of battle and triumphantly marched into Madrid unopposed. French troops fanned out across the peninsula, taking control of the important towns despite some fierce resistance. At Zaragoza, for example, starving but defiant citizens, in the manner of the ancient Iberians when the Romans attacked, threw back loaves of bread tossed over the city walls by French soldiers, trying to entice them to surrender. I guess they didn't like French bread. By the fall of 1810, the nucleus of Spain's loyalist government was cooped up in the seaport town of Cadiz in southern Spain. Surrounded by French troops, adding insult to injury, Joseph made a triumphal march through Andalusia, but the French occupation was an illusion. In spite of several 100,000 troops under a gaggle of illustrious French generals, including Napoleon, the peninsula was just too big to control. Communications lines were easily cut, and sizable armed escorts were required for simple things like delivering the mail. These guerrilleros, it's hard to say it, these guerrilla fighters struck at will, then retreated to mountain strongholds and hiding places. Britain soon realized the importance of Spain's resistance and dispatched General Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, who I'll from here now on call the Duke of Wellington, I'll call him Wellington, to Portugal. By the fall of 1810, he commanded about 25,000 British troops and about the same number of Portuguese, compared with the French force, at least 5 times that number. Yet Spaniards have never given the Iron Duke his proper due for helping to win the War of Independence. Madrid boasts no statue, no street in his honor, no park, no library, by the name of Wellington. Even though he liberated the capital from French occupation, nevertheless, victory was achieved in a two-pronged effort. Spanish guerrillas were numbering about 30,000, worked in perfect complement to British regulars in creating what Napoleon himself called his Spanish ulcer. These savvy, ruthless fighters could tie up and harass huge numbers of French troops, while Wellington and his aides carefully engineered one triumph after another. The breakdown of the Bourbon government led to the creation of local and regional governments called juntas, which tended to act with alarming independence and lack of cooperation with each other. Galicia sent its own emissary to London as nation to nation, and Seville and Granada nearly went to war against each other at one point. As regionalism approached anarchy, a central junta formed at Aranjuez to rule in the name of the imprisoned Fernando, the son of the king. Among its members were Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos, the great Spanish Enlightenment writer and philosopher, and the venerable Count of Floridablanca, mentioned him a little while ago. Later, the group was forced to flee first to Seville, then to Cadiz. The famous Cortes is what they call their little parliaments that would meet in each major city, a Cortes. The Cortes of Cadiz convened at the Church of San Felipe, Nero, and here they produced the famous Constitution of 1812, often called the birth certificate of liberal Spain. The men at Cadiz claimed to represent the nation in its darkest hour, but in reality they were a far cry from typical Spaniards. The city itself boasted Spain's most bourgeois, middle-class, liberal society, in which business acumen and commercial wealth counted more than aristocratic privilege. For obvious reasons, representatives from the different areas of Spain, especially the conservative interior, could not readily attend. There was a war going on. Instead, Cadiz residents from those cities or regions, and several from the colonies, invariably more progressive than their counterparts or compatriots back home, sat at the Cortes to decide the nation's future. But in reality, they would voice the interests of a tiny minority, which is why there will be many more constitutions. Spain holds the record for the number of constitutions throughout their history. This was the first one. There will be a dozen more. Okay? Each new power would take over and they'd write a new constitution. Then they'd get overthrown and they'd write a new constitution. Okay? But in reality, they voiced the interests of this tiny minority, and like I said, there'll be many more constitutions to come. The meeting of a single national parliament, as opposed to a traditional regional, what's the Spanish word for that? The regional Cortes, I guess, was a profound event. But it arrived long after the decline of Spain's medieval political institutions. Hence, there was no real tradition of unified representative power strong enough to stand up to the monarchy. So as soon as Fernando comes back, there isn't going to be any more constitution. The celebrated Constitution of 1812 was an even more daring step than one might imagine. Echoing the earlier American and French documents, it contained most of the liberal menu: sovereignty of the people, the sanctity of individual property rights, curtailment of aristocratic and church power, uniform laws, centralized government, and so on. Unfortunately, the Cadiz liberals, and by the way, the word liberal comes to us from Spanish history, okay? They invented it. These liberals were building castles in the sand. The admirable but totally impractical Constitution humbled Spain's two strongest institutions, the crown and the church, without creating anything strong enough to replace them in the people's minds. The monarchy was treated as a necessary evil, and the Catholic Church, although acknowledged as the only official religion of Spain, had to accept the closing of its monasteries and other insulting measures that we'll get to later. Inevitably, both monarch and bishops became instinctive enemies of the Cadiz liberals and their constitution, and will remain so for the next century and a half. Napoleon's downfall had begun on the peninsula, but as we know, the year 1812 brought in even more serious problems with his disastrous Russian campaign. In Spain, the Allies took advantage of large French troops' withdrawals to score a string of victories at Ciudad Rodrigo, Badajoz, and Salamanca, followed by Wellington's triumphal entry into Madrid, of which Beethoven composed a symphony in his honor for it. An event painted by Goya. The artist had to be restrained from shooting the outspoken general when he criticized Goya's work. The final victory came a year later at Vitoria in the Basque region in the north, when an army of 70,000 French was routed. King Joseph himself was present at the debacle and escaped capture by a whisker, losing his carriage and his silver chamber pot in the confusion. And every June 21st since then, every June 21st, in what must be one of the British Army's strangest traditions, the men of the 10th Hussars drink champagne from the replica of the pot. The original, they couldn't do it with the original because it sits in a Manchester museum, and there's a monument to the victory in Victoria's main square. For all intents and purposes, the War of Independence was over. The struggle had cost the French about 180,000 casualties and sealed Napoleon's eventual fate. The Spanish giant killer had dished out its revenge for centuries of French interference in their politics. Mild-mannered Joseph fled in the spring of 1814. Fernando, the desired one, as he will be known, returned to the ecstatic adulation of his people. But Spain's trouble were only just beginning. Except for the very brief Spanish-American War, 1898, and we'll be getting to that when we come back from our break, and some colonial strife in Morocco, the War of Independence was Spain's last foreign conflict. But the war and the French Revolution itself unleashed a host of internal conflicts that would haunt Spain for generations, as the source of countless political crises and several civil wars. Spanish nationalism was indeed born in this patriotic war against the French, but it was a highly reactionary variety that rallied to the defense of religion and king as well as country. Moreover, the national unity was hollow. Beneath the seeming solidarity, Spain was breaking into unyielding factions of conservatives and liberals, traditionalists and reformers. From the return of Fernando to the last days of General Franco in 1975, the two Spains would grapple with the problems of nations, same problems that are happening in much of the rest of modern Europe, and what Spain's role would be in that modern Europe. The war also meant the demise of Spain as a major European power. For the last century, Spain had piggybacked with France to enhance its standing among the nations. But once the invincible Napoleon was defeated, the facade of Spanish power was revealed for all its weakness. When the European powers met at the famous Congress of Vienna in 1815 to sew back together what Napoleon had torn apart, Spain was not even invited. What really hurt was that Spain had lost most of its great American empire during the Napoleonic invasion. Not all, but most. Sensing weakness with their rulers, the Creoles, remember the Creoles, the landowning class of Latin America? The Creoles convinced the lower classes, the mestizos, the mulattoes, the Indians, and the Africans, of imagined Spanish cruelty and declared their independence. Like Miranda and Bolivar, leaders like Miranda and Bolivar liberated future countries such as Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Venezuela, and Colombia. Starting in 1810, two rabble-rousing priests in Mexico named Hidalgo and Morelos founded an independent movement in Mexico that finally bore fruit in 1821. Although their attempts to turn it into a social revolution scared off the Creoles and left the final act of rebellion to be won by a turncoat Spanish soldier who later declared himself Emperor Augustine I. But don't worry about him, for he will soon be overthrown by the Mexican record holder for the greatest number of times being thrown in and out of office. Of course, I'm talking about the great Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. But that's another story. Ferdinand VII. Don't laugh. I tried to find a good picture of him. And I didn't paint that either. I don't know who did. But Ferdinand VII, he's the guy who his father abdicated and had him and then changed his mind, and Napoleon said, neither one of you, you're both out and my brother's in. Okay. His royal birth has always been suspect because of the long affair his mother had with her husband's chief minister, Manuel Godoy. Okay? Remember the menage a trois. He's a perfect example of the saying, being in the right place at the right time. Since he was hailed as the conquering hero by the time Waterloo came along, Napoleon's last and final defeat. Actually, he was neither a conqueror nor a hero. Born in 1785, he was only 29 when he began his triumphal march to Madrid at the conclusion of the Peninsular War. Yet he was already possessed of a debauched look. I'll let you be the judge. Bloated and bleary-eyed with a huge lip and drooping nose. Even his own mother called him ugly. And his mother-in-law used terms like hideous and utterly dull to describe him. Nevertheless, the vast majority of Spaniards believed him a savior who had successfully defied Napoleon while in captivity, while he supposedly planned Spain's liberation. We all know what he was doing instead. No one knew that he had spent these years living in vice and laziness in Talleyrand's Talleyrand was the former French foreign minister under Napoleon, and in the middle of downtown Paris is his splendid estate, magnificent building that is today the American Embassy. Forever trying to marry Napoleon's niece. He thought that would fix him up. Fernando's return coincided with the comeback of the French King Louis XVIII, brother of the ill-fated Louis XVI. Remember, when Louis XVI's head was chopped off, his son, whose name was also Louis, was in prison. I think he was 7 or 8 years old. To French royalists, as soon as the guillotine's blade fell and severed the head of Louis XVI, that son was Louis XVII. Although he never reigned, he died in prison a few years later. So when his brother came back, Louis XVI's brother came back, he took the title Louis XVIII. So that's how we get from Louis XVI to Louis XVIII. You got to remember the poor kid in prison. Anyway, this event, the restoration of these kings on the throne, of which Ferdinand VII is one, took place after the Congress of Vienna, when they agreed in Vienna that all of the monarchs who had any legitimacy at all would be placed back on the throne. In a wave of conservative reaction that swept across Europe. In Spain, jubilant crowds shouted, and I quote, "Long live our chains." long live despotism. That's what they wanted. That's what they were used to. Okay? Although some liberals pinned their hopes on the new king, like almost all of the post-Napoleonic restored kings, it soon became clear that he intended to turn the clock back to 1789 and the days of absolute monarchy before the French Revolution ever started. His first decree declared that the Constitution of 1812, that Constitution I told you the liberals put together in Cadiz, as I said, sometimes called the birth certificate of liberal Spain, he declared it null and void. And liberals who had fought the French while the king groveled before Napoleon were jailed or exiled. About 12,000 reputed French sympathizers were banished, and the Jesuits were invited to come back to Spain and resume their vice-like grip on education. To support this naked power play, Fernando relied on his army of mass supporters throughout Spain. In Cadiz, an angry mob sacked the Cortes building, the birthplace of the 1812 Constitution, and in pulpits across the land, liberal-bashing clergy thundered out their approval of the king's draconian methods. But in appealing to the masses, the church and crown released a genie that would never go back into the bottle again. Throughout the previous century, the people had been politically apathetic as reforms came from the top or just didn't happen at all. But the French Revolution, the revolt at the Aranjuez Palace, and the War of Independence changed all that. No longer were the common people mere cannon fodder and tillers of the fields. After all, they had just dethroned two kings named Bonaparte and created another. In the minds of many Spaniards, the monarchy's prestige had suffered tremendously and would never again enjoy its lofty status. Forget about the days of the Habsburgs, especially Philip II, Charles I. For 6 years, Spain had proved it could live without a king, and the new liberal ideas slowly began to spread. Slowly. I mean, we're talking at a century's pace here. One place they took root was in the Spanish army, where free-thinking officers resented such customs as having to daily say the rosary in formation. The rosary is a long prayer in the Catholic Church. They flocked to the anti-Catholic Masonic lodges and other liberal clubs to discuss change. The Freemasons, by the way, became the perennial boogeyman for Spanish reactionaries and friend of liberals, long after they were considered a harmless social fraternity in most other countries. Soon, some Spaniards had had enough of Fernando and started a liberal revolution. But this one came from an unexpected source, to say the least. In 1820, an army of reinforcements was sitting in Cadiz, awaiting transport to the Americas. Bored with their condition, eager for advancement, and hostile at having to fight and quite possibly die in the colonies, the officers and most of their troops revolted in the name of liberalism under the leadership of a Colonel Rafael de Riego. This was the first of what historians call officer-led revolts, but definitely not the last. Many European nations, including Russia, will experience these unusual revolts led by army officers. Unusual because, well, one would expect the army to put down a revolution, not encourage it, not lead it. But this is yet another manifestation of the influence of the French Revolution on European history. Even in post-revolutionary France, there was some form of constitution, and elections often were held for a variety of government positions. Many officers returning from the occupation of France after Waterloo began to wonder why they couldn't have some of these freedoms and privileges. Why can't we have an election? Why can't we have someone able to stand on the soapbox and call the king every name in the book without getting his head chopped off? In Spain, from 1820 to 1874, there was one such revolt every 20 months. Now let me say that again. In Spain, from 1820 to 1874, a period of 54 years, there was such a revolt every 20 months. Okay? On the average. The liberals had let loose a lion onto the Spanish political scene. Garrisons throughout Spain rose in support of Riego, and the king's People's Army failed to react. A few months later, a thoroughly humiliated Fernando pledged to adopt reforms. Riego and his band called for the return of the Constitution of 1812 and other changes, including an end to the Spanish Inquisition. Time had already done its damage to this once almighty body, the Inquisition. When a mob broke into one of the Inquisition's few remaining prisons, they found one French priest comfortably housed in the attic and reluctant to leave. All Europe was astonished at Riego's daring coup d'etat, or pronunciamiento, as they were called in Spain. The coups were called pronunciamientos. The first crack in its post-war conservative monolith. Meanwhile, the liberals brought to power by Riego were splitting into conservative, which they were called moderates, moderados, and radicals, exaltados, different wings. We see this happen everywhere, don't we? The splitting off of various political factions, depending upon how liberal or conservative you are. It's happening today, everywhere. The classic division between those who wanted slow, orderly change, men of property and position, and those preaching social revolution, the urban radicals. Civil disorder was driving the radical liberals to despotic measures that alienated what little popular support they had. Liberal Spain became a hollow facade, and when Fernando appealed to other monarchs of Europe, including France, only a handful of Spaniards objected. Said one disgruntled liberal officer, and I quote, "The Constitution was made entirely for the people, but they hated it." The French king sent an army into Spain to aid his fellow despot in 1823, which he called the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, which were more like a military promenade than an invasion. Although he promised amnesty, Fernando immediately unleashed a reign of terror against liberals that shocked even the French. Riego was taken to the center of Madrid in a coal cart, there to be hanged, drawn, and quartered for public display. The mere possession of his picture carried the death penalty. And hundreds went to the gallows, but from Riego's revolt to Franco in 1939, there will be over 100 revolts or coups or pronunciamientos, or some form of civil strife emanating from the army. The remaining decade of Fernando's reign was an era of knee-jerk reactionism and bureaucratic bungling. The king's ministers were mediocre sycophants, each kept in ignorance of his colleagues' policies. After the war, the nation was devastated, its trade and industry in shambles, countryside depopulated and infested with bandits. Visitors often commented on the squalid poverty, appalling roads, and wretched inns. There was a golden age. This was the golden age of the bandoleros. Often guerrillas reluctant to abandon their arms and lives of freedom. Most famous was Hinojosa Cobacho, better known as El Tempranillo, who controlled much of Andalusia for a decade. In Spain, the king rules, But in the Sierra, I do, he declared. Then in the midst of all this mess, along comes another succession crisis. By 1829, Fernando's 3 marriages had all failed to produce any surviving children. Hence, his younger brother, Carlos, stood to inherit the throne. Carlos had a positive reputation as one who always stood up to Napoleon and therefore represented the really reactionary forces of Spain. His followers called themselves Carlists, and their ultra-conservative and pro-church philosophy became known as Carlism. They considered Fernando too soft on liberals and longed for the day of his death when their hero would become king, since Fernando had no children. In the middle of all this, Fernando marries a 4th time to his Italian niece, Maria Cristina, of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. She gives birth to 2 daughters, Isabella and Fernanda. This turn of events whirled the Carlists only a little. Since way back during the War of the Spanish Succession, the Bourbon Philip V, that was Louis XIV's grandson, had promulgated the French Salic Law. You remember what the French Salic Law was? Basically, it said, no woman can rule. Sorry, ladies. The feminists would have had a field day. Women were ineligible to inherit the throne. Can you name a queen of France? Marie Antoinette was a queen consort, but there were no queen regnants, no reigning queen, because of the Salic Law that goes all the way back to the days of Charlemagne and the Franks that said women cannot rule. Sorry, okay? And so Carlos was still in line. He didn't worry about the 2 daughters that Fernando had. But in 1789, a secret Castilian Cortes repealed the Salic Law, thus paving the way for a woman, in this case, his eldest daughter, Isabella, to gain the throne. 3 years later, as Fernando lay dying, he repudiated his daughter's right to succession. But upon his death, the repudiation was ruled unlawful, and Isabella became queen anyway. Now, before you applaud, wait till I tell you about Isabella, okay, well, which I won't get to today. I'll start it today. This would lead to another civil war. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Okay? Called the First Carlist War. And you know, since it's called the First Carlist War, you know there's going to be another one. I mean, when you were young and got married the first time, if you introduced your wife as your first wife, you're going to get slapped, aren't you? Yeah. This First Carlist War lasted from 1833 to 1839. But like I said, there will be more. So let's talk about Isabella. Now, when you see that painting of her, and later on when I show you what she really looked like, you will understand why monarchs hated photography. Okay? She will rule from 1833 to 1868. Lucky for Isabella, the army and the generals supported the monarchy since she was only 3 years old when she became queen, and her mother acted as regent. Therefore, she survived the Carlist War, who hated her. The backbone of Carlist support came from the ranks of traditional Spain. That is, the clergy, ultra-conservative monarchists, and foot-dragging peasants, especially from the northern areas with long histories of regional rights, such as the Basque areas, Navarre, and the mountainous areas of Aragon, and of course, Catalonia. Don Carlos, the Carlist War, Carlos, swore he would uphold these local rights under the famous oak tree of Guernica, a symbol of Basque freedom. But Carlism was not just a champion of regional rights, it was also a reaction against the modern world. Hence, its predominantly rural supporters shared a strong hatred for cities and other liberal ways. Many of those who answered to the Carlist battle cry of "Viva Christ the King" would be the same types who formed the ranks of Franco's army in the 1930s. But the whole idea was doomed from the start. A romantic and tragic attempt to rewrite history backwards. Indeed, Wellington often referred to Don Carlos as, and I quote, "one of the silliest devils I ever met," unquote. Spain's political history in the 19th century was a comic opera in which almost every act ended in tragedy. The Carlist War, fought over the next 6 years, 1833, 1839, cost Spain 140,000 lives. The Carlist ferocity was legendary, with soldier priests of the exterminating angel leading their troops in appalling barbarities. The red beret warriors seemed to attract the best and worst types, and their campaigns often became mere excuses for murder. Almost the entire army remained loyal to Isabella and the Regency. But the Carlists were guerrilla fighters, and government forces had problems winning decisive victories without resorting to the same kind of atrocities committed by the opposition. In addition, anti-clerical mobs sacked convents, murdered monks to destroy the perceived enemy of the liberal state, the Catholic Church. An outbreak of cholera was blamed on priests poisoning the wells, and mobs killed about 70 clerics. Said one writer of the war, "Here lies half of Spain done to death by the other half." The First Carlist War witnessed the birth of popular anti-clericism in Spain, which reached ghastly proportions in the next century. And I'll give you examples of that too when we get to it. Whether as victim or instigator, the church and one's attitude toward it lay at the heart of most of Spain's social questions. As a popular expression of the time put it, and I quote once again, "Everyone in Spain goes to church, half with a candle, the other half with a club." Much like the upcoming Civil War of the 1930s, the Carlist War captured the attention of all of Europe, which saw it as a mortal struggle between liberalism and reaction. Idealists, adventurers, and journalists descended on Spain to fight the good fight. This produced its share of bizarre incidents, such as a young Irish aristocrat who used his yacht to seize Malaga briefly in the name of Don Carlos. Later, he was named the Bishop of Dublin. The war reached a stalemate in 1834. Meanwhile, Spain, under the regency of Maria Cristina, was undergoing profound changes. Liberals returned from exile in droves to relight the torch extinguished by Fernando VII. A new constitution, number 2, granted limited suffrage, centralized government, and bourgeois property rights, and was supported by both radicals and some conservatives. Although there would be other constitutions and countless crises and military coups over the next few decades. These two liberal political groupings divided power and patronage between them for almost a century. The conservatives usually held the upper hand. They were the bourgeois landowners and aristocrats who championed property rights and included high-placed civil servants, army officers who wished order above all, and lawyers who defended the status quo for handsome fees, as we all know they like to do. Their task was to defend the ruling class, without resorting to the threadbare arguments of the Carlists. The progressives counted among their supporters a few generals and most of the junior officers, merchants, needy journalists, and the aspiring urban lower middle class. During the height of the Carlist War and anti-clerical frenzy, the regent called on Basque financial wizard named Juan Mendizabal to head the government. A decree in 1835 closed all religious orders, and in Madrid alone, 44 churches and monasteries were shut down. Then, in an act of vast impact, the banker, Mendizabal, launched a program of land reform that confiscated church property used for religious services and offered it for sale. About 1/4 of all church lands went on the auction block the first 2 years, more than any other single action. This action created the permanent breach between progressive liberalism and the Catholic Church that lasts to the present day in Spain. Now, why did the Queen appoint this person to do this? She hoped it would end the war. She hoped by appeasing them and getting rid of about half of the church's land, it would ease it, but it didn't. Naturally, poor peasants did not have the money to buy the land they worked, and wealthy landlords and speculators snapped up most of the bonanza. Thus, the large transfer of property since the Reconquest, the largest transfer of property since the Reconquest, brought no agrarian reform, and in one case, lands farmed by 6,000 families suddenly supported only 400. Indeed, the Andalusian latifundia system of huge estates worked by the landless peasants became worse, all in the name of liberalism. Once again, the law of unintended consequences. Even more important, the reformers put an end to land entailment, which means that land could be inherited by your offspring. That was called entailment, which drove a huge wedge between the two liberal factions. The reforms also pushed vast numbers of landless peasants who regarded collective land use, a God-given right, into the arms of the Carlists, and much later to the anarchists. Wait till I start talking about them. The centralized state in Madrid became the sworn enemy of both the extreme right and the extreme left, which shared much more in political philosophy than is commonly realized. Other legislation based on the French model created the 49 provinces of modern Spain, often without regard to local traditions and ties. Thus, well-meaning reformers sowed the seeds of modern regionalism, most notably in Catalonia and in the Basque areas. But anyway, back to the war. Let's finish that up. In 1837, the Carlists risked everything in a final disastrous march on Madrid. As one historian put it, they lost because they were even madder than their opposition. At Vergara, two opposing generals embraced symbolically, recognizing Isabella as the legitimate queen. Don Carlos, there's Don Carlos, one of history's great pretenders, retired to France with several thousand of his followers, many of whom committed suicide. After this, Carlism was confined mostly to the region of Navarre, the mostly Basque area along the Spanish-French border. During this war, two anti-Carlist parties emerged to run the government: the Progressive Party and the Moderate Party. Both were basically liberal in general attitudes, but held slight differences in how the government should be run. Both supported Isabella against the Carlists. The progressives were a little bit to the left of the moderates, but not much. They tended to be co-opted by Isabella's continued compromises with the Carlists in order to end the war, like the things that she did. The Progressive Party disintegrated gradually after the murder of its last leader, General Juan Prim, in 1870, splitting into the Constitutional Party, the Radical Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party. Don't confuse these terms with similar names of other parties in other countries like our own. They had nothing to do with each other, okay? It wasn't formally dissolved, however, until the 1874 restoration of the monarchy. The moderates were a continuation of the Docianistas. The Docianistas, doce is the Spanish word for 12, the Constitution of 1812. So they called themselves the Docianistas. Okay? Their principal ideas were strong royal power, pure capitalism, domestic peace, and total centralism, with all power emanating from Madrid. When the war concluded in 1837, they wrote a new constitution. This one of the Constitution of 1837, its principal legacy was to restore most, but not all, of the progressive features of the Constitution of 1812, and to entrench the concepts of constitutionalism, parliamentarianism, and separation of powers in Spain. The army emerged from the war as Spain's most solid institution. The generals demanded payment in the form of taking command of Spanish politics. Interestingly, it was the liberals who were the most successful in forcing their programs on the nation. What has been called the age of romantic militarism began in 1840 with another pronunciamiento, another coup. This time by a general named Espartero that ousted Maria Cristina, the regent, but left Isabella on the throne. Maria Cristina had appealed to him for support at one point, but he sensed her weakness and unpopularity, so he just took over. Espartero would last less than 3 years, whereupon another coup would come along, led by two moderate generals named Serrano and Narvaez, forced Espartero out. The pattern was established. During the 116 years, listen to this, during the 116 years from Espartero's pronunciamiento to Franco's 1936 coup, there will be more than 100 coups or near coups by the military. Thank God our founding fathers put the military under civilian control. Amen. Amen. How lucky we are. How lucky we are. Well, what about Isabella? The fall of Isabella I, the fall of Espartero, marks her coming of age. And as she was made queen at the age of 13. She was a poor successor to her namesake, Isabella I, prompting one Spanish historian to say her coming of age was a pure constitutional fiction. One English source described her as, quote, one to whom the graces of majesty are altogether wanting. Queen Isabella was never of age. Though she died a grandmother, for all intents and purposes, Spain ceased to have a real monarchy. Certainly not one that was absolute. Isabella was plump, comely, easygoing without pretensions, generous and good-hearted, and above all, passionate. Shortly after her accession, she lent herself to a harebrained plot involving a dashing cavalry officer that brought down the government. Like a reckless teenager who never grew up, Isabella let her passions rule. She rivals Catherine the Great as history's most lascivious queen. And there are a lot to choose from in this category. Royal counselors began to worry that an heir might arrive on the scene before a husband. So, a search began among Europe's most eligible bachelors. The unfortunate choice for the hot-blooded 16-year-old queen was her Bourbon cousin, Francisco de Assis. Now here's the couple. Photograph. Okay? Who had a high, squeaky voice and was dubbed Paquita. Not really an English word that translates Paquita, maybe Fanny? Fanny? As my mom used to always say, get your Fanny in here! Okay. He was rumored to be a homosexual. Rumors, not that there's anything wrong with it. Later, Isabella described her honeymoon by saying, what can I say of a man who on his wedding night wore more lace than I? But to everyone's amazement, children began to arrive. like clockwork, although of questionable paternity. Almost everyone thought these offspring to be illegitimate, but no one could prove it. 9 children altogether, with 5 living to adulthood. The history of Isabella's reign was largely consumed with power struggles between 3 rival generals. Espatero, who will later be overthrown, Narvaez, and an interesting gentleman with a Irish surname, Leopoldo O'Donnell. Narvaez dominated, but there were 40 different ministries and 18 coup attempts, punctuated by a new constitution favoring whoever took power, with each succeeding constitution eroding whatever the previous one said. Every once in a while, the Carlists would start another Carlist war, but they never got anywhere. Since the voting machinery was corrupt, the revolution, it just, in all its forms, was the only hope for change. It was the only way to go. Ironically, however, it was a period of relative peace and prosperity, relative, that is, to Spain. Okay. Sounds like things are going bad. Well, you ain't seen nothing yet. They're going to get a lot worse, a lot worse. So I'll see you, not next time, but the time after, on the 15th of October. Okay? Hope to see you then. Thank you very much.